So, hello everybody. I'm Hannah Charlton, and this is the introduction to Illuminated Manuscripts. If you were able to attend this last year, welcome back. We're going to be looking at a lot of the same materials, but hopefully we'll get to learn a little bit more. So, good. So to start, an illuminated manuscript is, of course, a handwritten and then hand-decorated book. So before books could be printed, they had to be, of course, copied by hand. So this is an art form that dates, we usually say roughly the year 400 to about the 1400s with the invention of the printing press. So it's about 1,000 years of history with incredible variations in style and materials. So we're going to have a look at that today. And this has been a fascinating thing for me to explore since I didn't know that this art form existed. I did get a lot of education for other art forms, but manuscripts were never something I learned about. All right, so I'm going to start a little presentation. All right, and everybody should see Introduction to Illuminated Manuscripts. All right, so again, this is a very varied art form. It's 1,000 years of history spanning from Europe to the Middle East. Many languages use this art form. And we'll start off with some really basic vocabulary, starting with the codex. The codex is just what we mean by a book as we know it. All the pages are sandwiched together and bound on one side, as opposed to written on a scroll. Most of these manuscripts would have the text block in one section that was usually justified, like what you see here. You can see that any spaces left over are filled in with elaborate little shapes. And the miniature is the term that we use pretty generally, but it's the picture, the illustration. It's a miniature in that it's smaller than other kinds of paintings. Initials are, like the name suggests, an initial letter. This is usually what people think of is when you say, you know how like in the old Disney books, the old Disney movies, the book opens up and there's a giant, beautiful letter. Those are the initial letters. You can have them plain, or you can have a historiated initial, which is another image inside the letter. So you can put in an enormous amount of information just in a single page. And then there's at the base of the page, this is another space to put in more images. So what we're looking at now is a prayer book. It's a book of hours, so different prayers that could be said throughout the day at specific times. So we have the Annunciation up here with Mary and the angel. And at the base of the page, you have the next part of that story, which is Mary's wedding. And so you're able to, again, put a lot of information on a single page. And of course, on the one side here, we have the patron. Since these books were handwritten and hand decorated, they were extremely expensive, not even considering the materials, which we'll get to go into more. But if you were wealthy enough to have one of these books made for you, you are wealthy enough to have them put in a picture of you. So you can see the patron here is very dutifully praying with this book. And as she says her prayers, this beautiful vision of the Virgin opens up before her eyes. And then there is the recto, which is the right side, and the verso on the left side. That's just a useful thing to know when you're looking at manuscripts. Instead of having page numbers, they'll have the sheet number and then whether it's on the right side or the left side. And what we have here is a really popular medieval story about three travelers who went on a journey and then met three spooky skeletons. And then they learned that the skeletons are them from the future. So very medieval there. And a pretty popular way to store these prayer books was to actually have them as a girdle book, which meant the covers were attached to a little bag that could then be hung by your belt. So you would get to open up your prayer book and at the specific time, turn to the right page. When you were done, close it up, tie it up in the bag, and hang it by your belt again. A really, really fun little invention for tiny books. So going over the process, this is where, again, a lot of the expense comes in, starting with the parchment. So parchment was a paper substitute. In the Middle Ages, people didn't have access to papyrus as much as they had before, and paper hadn't really made its way over yet. And so parchment is made from animal skin. It's very durable. It's very, very tough. You can actually scrape off mistakes, and because the material is so thick, you can just take them off entirely. But it is very expensive since you're basically writing on thin sheets of leather. And so this meant that if you think of monasteries, some of them are vegetarian, and that means they can't access all those animal skins. It also means that a single book would add up to a huge number of dead animals going into a single book. Like the Book of Kells was about 200 baby cows just for the parchment. The next step would have been pricking or ruling, which is basically setting up the layout. Manuscripts were made to be copied, since without the printing press, the only way to take one book and make more of it was to just physically make more step by step. So a lot of these copies would have similar layouts. And finally, once you actually start making the book, you start with the text, because the text is the one place where you are most likely to make a mistake. So you want to get it over with before you start adding any other expensive materials. On that note, scribes actually had a patron demon whose name was Titibolus, and his job was to force scribes to make mistakes, to sort of trip them up. So other fields had patron saints, scribes had a patron demon. So if you've ever been working on a project and typing something up and you suddenly make an incredible mistake that you just can't believe, it was Titibolus. He made you make a mistake. It's a great little out. The next step, generally speaking, would have been the gold, either gold leaf or gold ink. This was obviously really expensive part of the process. Not all manuscripts would have gold in them, but this is the step that really animates a manuscript. This is what will react to the light. It's what makes a book seem really, really precious and magical. And finally, people would put in the color. And this is actually where a lot of the expense was. In the Middle Ages and the medieval period, paints were extremely difficult to make. This is something that's really easy to take for granted now that we have synthetic pigments. But for many years, the best sources of color were from semi-precious stones like lapis and azurite. So these were very expensive materials, and you were grinding them up and using them as paint. In some cases, the colors could even be more expensive than the gold. The best color red was said to have been the blood of a dragon and an elephant who had killed each other in battle. So if you could get your hands on that, sure, it would be great. But colors are really hard to make. Most things, as we know, just turn brown once they dry. So the very, very best blue in the world was made from lapis. So if you've ever had lapis jewelry or seen the stones, this is the stuff that would have been ground up to make the most beautiful blue. So if you see a painting that you learn was made with lapis or was made with a very specific ultramarine blue, that paint was probably the most expensive thing. That's also one of the reasons why the Virgin Mary is always pictured in blue, is because that was the most expensive and most precious color. And this is what I want people to really take home about manuscripts, is that they are heavy, they're huge, because even if you have extremely small handwriting, these books are going to be pretty big. You can't make them as small as you can make text. So books in many ways had a different function from how we use them today. You can't curl up with a manuscript on a rainy day because, one, it's too expensive, and it's also probably too heavy. What we're looking at now is the Codex Amiatinus. This was one of the first, what we today is generally considered a complete Bible, so with 60 plus books. And this is what it looks like. And it takes two people to carry it. It is huge. So sometimes manuscripts would be kept as relics rather than texts to consult. If you've heard of the Book of Kells, that book was also not really read so much as just viewed and owned. These were really important pieces that had a different function from other books. So I'm going to go over some fun highlights of other manuscripts. What I want people to learn is that you can see so many manuscripts today, more than you could even in the Middle Ages, because a lot of museums and libraries are putting their collections online. And even before the internet, it was very hard to see a manuscript because you had to get special access. They're very fragile, and opening and reading them is a really delicate process. So all of these can be found online, and you can zoom in, you can look at every single bit. It's fantastic. The workshop bestiary is just like a modern bestiary, a collection of mythical and real beasts. Only instead of the statistics of the various beasts, it is usually some kind of moral lesson about all these animals. What we have here is a dragon with a little jewel on his head, and the man wants to steal the jewel. But if he makes eye contact, he'll turn to stone. So, trying to play a trick, the dragon's onto it. Don't know how it'll end. And so some of these were, again, real animals. So like donkeys and horses. And this right here, you can see somebody made this horse, and then probably a little kid drew a little horse under this one. It's the cutest thing. And again, these books were made to be copied. So what we have here is a page from the workshop bestiary, which was then copied because this is how knowledge spread. And so that included the layout, the text, and the images. We have an ibex or antelope here, and this is called a Yale, which was a mythical beast that had two horns that were flexible. So while we managed to hold on to some medieval beasts like unicorns and dragons, the Yale just hasn't made the cut. Too bad. Next highlight, this one is, like the name suggests, in the Morgan Library in New York, like the bestiary. And this one started out as just a collection of miniatures. So these will mostly be what we call the Old Testament. And over hundreds of years, people added captions, first in Latin, then in Persian, and finally in Judeo-Persian, which is Hebrew letters. So over hundreds of years, these different people who spoke different languages were able to comment on this single collection of miniatures because all these different people recognize these stories. And it is gorgeously illustrated. It is a very, very beautiful book. It's called the Crusader Bible because it was commissioned for a knight around the time of the Crusades. And that means there are a lot of battle scenes. but it has a very beautiful, very graphic style, similar to like stained glass more than other miniatures. And so many battle scenes. And a bit of gory imagery coming up. But yeah, they really like to draw intestines. I don't know. But it's a very, very beautiful book that was used quite a lot for a visual resource. So if you needed an image of a man holding an axe, you could have a look at this book and make a sketch and then put that in your own book. So it was a really useful sort of source book. And this is the detail that's new to this presentation. There are swords in the Morgan Crusader Bible that have names. So you have King David here with his sword that is named Odysmort, which means hate and death. So this medieval person named this sword like hate death, which I can't believe was allowed. But I guess kids don't feel bad about naming your swords. You can name your sword Hate Death. There's also another one which means joyous. In the typical medieval way, it has a bunch of I's instead of J's. But all of a sudden, in the Morgan Bible, there are all of these swords with these really awesome names. And finally, as we get to the end of manuscript history, we get into the really extravagant phase. By this point, people are learning about the printing press, books are being printed instead of handwritten, and so the manuscripts that are made are just sumptuous. So that's why we have the very rich hours, because it is impossibly rich. Like the Book of Hours we looked at before, this was a collection of prayers to be said at specific times of day. It was made for the Duke of Berry, which you can see here in his very ostentatious robe. And up here we have the zodiac. So all of these miniatures are from the calendar in the rich hours, but you can see the numbers were never put in. This book is gorgeous, but it was never quite finished. Unfortunately, the artists who were working on it sadly died of plague, so this book was just never finished. But it has beautiful, beautiful images that are really detailed and show the different activities in courtly life that are done at different times of day and different times of the year. So here we have April, where the proper thing to do is to go out and enjoy the springtime and to go on hunts. So it's an incredibly beautiful manuscript that is also just way too much. It is so richly detailed and so expensive. It's a bit overwhelming. And so, hundreds of years later, manuscripts obviously were no longer being made, but there was still a lot of interest in the style of manuscripts, especially during the arts and crafts movement, which was started around the turn of the century and was really interested in medieval styles and medieval crafts. And so these are all printed images, but you can see the influence that medieval art had on them. You have these initial letters, you have a sort of Gothic inspired font, and the figures are a bit more medieval than they are Renaissance. They're pretty slim and rigid. And you have, of course, all of these beautiful, beautiful plants and vines and twisting shapes. So in their own way, manuscripts were sort of able to transform and continue to, if not exist, continue to influence the world. They're a little difficult to talk about since we don't have any modern equivalent to an illuminated manuscript. We still have paintings, we still have sculptures, but there's no need for a book that's handwritten and hand decorated. That's just not something we need anymore. So in my own work, I'm very influenced, of course, by the Morgan Bible. And one of the things I'm interested in is how we depict medieval people and how they depicted themselves. And so that's what's behind the Song of Ice and Fire series, which you can possibly recognize here with the dragon and the three houses. I think it's fascinating that people left behind these beautiful works of art that for a long time just existed behind covers that only the very wealthy people could even read, let alone open up these books to see them. So I don't begrudge the printing press for existing at all. I think mass literacy is a wonderful thing. But I do think that this is a beautiful art form that I think still has a lot to offer us. And most importantly, I do think it's important to consider how we look at the past. A lot of the time we consider the Middle Ages to be the Dark Ages, this terrible time where everything was bad, the art was bad, and then the Renaissance came and saved everybody. And that's, I don't think, how it really happened. I think this was a beautiful time period that has a lot to offer. Good. All right, I'm going to switch back to our friend WebEx. Sorry for that. There we are. All right. Oh no, delays. All right. Very good. So that's the very basics of illuminated manuscripts. A very quick introduction, but again, I encourage everybody to have a look at, especially the Morgan Library. They have so many manuscripts. New York City was very lucky at the turn of the century in getting lots of really good manuscripts from Europe. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France, France's National Library, they have gorgeous manuscripts that they will actually let you download. So there's still so much to learn, and this is such a gorgeous art form that I want more people to learn about. So, would people like to see me do a little bit of illuminating? Want to see the materials in action? Right, I'm going to switch cameras very quickly. Mhm. All right, so what we have here are parchment pieces. So parchment, like I said, is very, very tough and great to work with, but it's expensive and kind of a pain. You can see here, there was one side that was at one point on the outside of the animal. This was called the hair side, and you can just barely see the little follicles in there. And the flesh side was at one point on the inside of the animal, so it's slightly smoother. And of course, what happens if the animal gets a bug bite? Well, the bug bite stays, and then once you stretch out the skin to make the parchment, the hole gets stretched along with it. So you have a lot of manuscripts where the text just has to go around that hole. But you can see there's a little bit of variation in how transparent the parchment is. These are just little scraps, so it's not the best that the material has to offer, but it does, I think, show out the strengths and weaknesses of this material. And here we have a little bit of azurite, which is a beautiful sparkly blue stone, and our friend lapis, which makes fantastic jewelry and impossibly beautiful paints. So for my own work, what I use instead of parchment, which I find to be a little bit greasy, I like to use vegan parchment. So this is cellulose, so basically paper that's been treated to act in much the same way as parchment. So it's still very sturdy, you can still scrape off mistakes, and it's great to work with, and it isn't greasy, and it's vegan. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful material to work with. Yay! All right. Excellent. I see some folks are talking about Codex Pokemon is loving it. Very good. All right. Yes. Many medieval artists probably were edgelords. What can we say? It's one of those things where if I put it, speaking about the Otis Mort sword, if I was writing a fantasy novel, I'd be a little bit embarrassed to name anything Otis Mort, but I mean it's the Middle Ages. They got to do it. All right. So if I have my wonderful vegan parchment here, that is so great to work with. I always start with a felt tip pen, which is not historically accurate, but is very convenient to use. And then if I just have a female figure here, see, one of my favorite things about the Morgan is the fashion. It's pretty basic, like men and women basically have just one or two set costumes, but it's clear that the artist really, really liked drawing drapery. In a similar way, though, the artist had like two faces that they could do, which could make some of the expressions a little bit awkward. I do think that that's one downfall of medieval art is the expressions were a little bit lacking. All right. So here's my female figure. Oh, having a grand old time. So, all right. Very good. So I don't have too much time. So I do want to show off the baby brush, which is a size 0000. So this is what I used for this little figure here. It is so small and so wee. Everybody recognizes it as like a Warhammer miniatures brush, which is very good. Ah, yes, the snails and the marginalia, absolutely. So a very, very common thing to see in manuscripts, common in that it shows up a lot and people still aren't sure what the joke is. It's seems to be a reference to something, but we're not sure what, is rabbits and rabbits jousting. So you'll have all of these scenes of rabbits fighting knights and knights fighting rabbits, or rabbits torturing knights. It gets very, very dark. But yeah, I really do think it was some kind of joke that we just didn't hold on to. All right. So I use a gold ink, which is great to work with so long as the cap doesn't stick. And unfortunately, the cap usually sticks. But instead of like gold leaf and gesso, I just use the nice Winsor & Newton ink that has a watch on it. It's fantastic. And best of all, if I decide I want to do something in gold, so I'm going to give this lady a crown, I can do it. And the gold, since it isn't transparent, will go right over all of the lines. So this is a bit non-traditional, but I do think the gold is great to work with, the gold ink. And there are some manuscripts that used the gold ink similar to this one instead of gold leaf. It allows you to get a little bit more detail since you're not putting down a glue and then putting on some gold on top of that and then brushing away the excess. You're just adding a little bit of gold powder. And I get to use fantastic gouache paints, which thank goodness I get to use as much blue as I like, and I don't have to sell my house to get it. So gouache is a kind of opaque watercolor. So if you have ever wanted to try it, I really recommend it. I think it's pretty easy to use. You can see it goes down pretty easily. So if you've ever painted with, say, a watercolor set, one of those old plastic Crayola sets, gouache will work in pretty much the same way. Just get it to a nice milky consistency and then put it down and you're good to go. A more proper material would have been like an egg tempera, but gouache does a pretty good job of mimicking the nice opaque paints. Gonna check the discard again. Hey. Ah, gorgeous. Oh, yes, the Great Rabbit War. Goodness, yes. Islamic texts are one type of manuscript that I want so badly to learn more about. They're just impossibly beautiful. I did have one person at last year's session say that because the work was so detailed, it was pretty common for scribes to go blind from just how bad it is for your eyes to look at a piece that closely. And so it was said that you had created such beautiful works of art that God had blinded you because you had created and beheld the most beautiful thing. Ah, gorgeous. All right, thank you so much. All right, Connie posted the exhibit site. So thank you very much. Oh, that's gorgeous. Okay, I'm gonna call it good there. All right. While that dries, what I do, here we go. Have a look. So I always like to show people just how beautiful these manuscripts can be, and again, how fantastic it is to see them online. Oh, wonderful. And museums are also very good about explaining what's going on in all these images. Especially in the Morgan Crusader Bible, where you have all of these captions in all these different languages. It's really, really helpful to have all these experts tell you what's going on. All right. Good. All right. So, Connie, would it be all right for me to share this website page? So I do want people to see. Oh, everybody's reacting with a pleading face. I love it. I'm going to zoom in a bit. Yes, people are talking about grotesqueries. Those are little nonsense images. So like the rabbits that we were discussing, the rabbits that are catching and torturing knights, those are part of grotesqueries. Sometimes these would be like man-bird hybrids, just about anything, really surreal stuff. I'm going to share that for a moment. All right. So again, this is a fantastic resource because you can pan all around. You can zoom in to see incredible detail, like this very surprised bunny here. Doesn't seem too keen on what's going on. And again, all of these great explanations of what's happening in these manuscripts. One of my favorite things about manuscripts from this region are the beautiful, beautiful rocks and the very happy goats. These goats are pleased to be here. But it's a chance to put in a little bit of expressionism, a little bit of extra spice. So you aren't just seeing figures and horses and buildings. It's a way for the artist to have a bit more fun. Oh, I love it so much. It's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Everybody, have a look. National Museum of Asian Art. Fantastic. All right. And finally, we have about 10 minutes left. I do have some images from the Book of the City of Ladies. Do people know? Do people know the Book of the City of Ladies? Has anyone heard of this one? Oh, this is so fun. You know, museums and libraries have gotten so good about sharing things. It's fantastic, especially during the pandemic. Being able to visit all of these, really being able to visit all the manuscripts and to be able to look at every single page. People will ask me if have you seen the Book of Kells? And I always say no, no, I haven't seen the Book of Kells. I have seen it online and I've seen it in greater detail than anybody who goes to see it in person has. All right, gonna do one more quick share of this is the latest series that I've been working on based on the Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan, which is a collection of famous women in history written in the early 1400s. So it's a medieval woman's perspective on great women in history. I will share that. And get that to play. So Again, this is very inspired by the Morgan Crusader Bible. I love those heavy black comic style outlines. And so Christine de Pizan talks about the Amazons, who she describes as a real group of women who had all of these very wise and very powerful queens who fought people like Hercules and Theseus and Achilles. And she describes them as these fantastic warrior women. And when I was doing research for this project, I learned that the Amazons actually were real. There was a real group of people in what we would call Eurasia. The women would ride horses. They had more or less equal status to men in their society, and they could fight. And so in Greece, this was interpreted as these terrifying, crazy warrior women who hated men just because they could ride horses. So for so long, I had thought, oh, the Amazons weren't real. They're cool, but they weren't real. Turns out they were. It's fantastic. And so Queen Penthesilea here is fighting Achilles with her Gerudo shield from the Breath of the Wild. Couldn't resist that one. And Christine de Pizan, again, a woman who was writing in the very early 1400s, dedicated a section to witches. She was very, very into all of these famous witches in history. So we have Manto, who could talk to spirits and get them to tell her the future. There was Medea, who could craft spells using all of these different herbs and plants. And there was Circe, who could transform people into animals. So reading this for the first time, I couldn't believe it. This was a woman who talked about, famous virgin martyrs and various saints, but she also talked about witches. And it was no big deal. These weren't like scary demon women. They were just women who were really, really talented at magic. And so when researching this one, I learned that magic didn't really come to be seen as an evil thing until pretty late in history. It was seen as a pretty diverse practice. There were some practices of magic that were focused on plants. Some of them were focused on learning incantations and figuring out how to summon demons. But they kind of got mushed together later on in history, and the story became that all witches are bad, all magic is bad, and specifically all magical women are bad. So it's so interesting to read about how medieval people actually thought. There aren't too many books that we can still read, but a few survive, like the Book of the City of Ladies, so we get to learn how people in the Middle Ages actually saw themselves. And they saw witches as pretty cool, just powerful women, which I just love to learn about. Yes, perspectives on magic, those are so dependent on regions and cultures. And yes, Christine de Pizan, one of the few professional writers during that era, some say the first professional writer in France, but it depends on how you define these things. But yes, I absolutely recommend checking out the Book of the City of Ladies. It's pretty easy to get a hold of, and it's just a catalog of over 100 brilliant women. She's very positive all throughout, talking about how it's important for women to be educated, all of the great things that women can achieve. And she's very careful to always point out that these women are exemplars. They aren't weird exceptions. She doesn't talk about how these women weren't like other girls. She's very, very positive. It's a fantastic book. So I highly recommend getting that one. All right. So we have just a couple minutes. Are there any questions at the moment? I can pop into the Discord for a moment. And the one difficult thing about that adorable tiny brush is that it's very easy to lose. Brush, you were too small. How much time does it take me to illuminate a full page? Most of the time is spent on research. That's the big thing. And doing all of the layout. I actually plan most of my pieces on graph paper, which I can cut and paste and sort of puzzle piece together. And it allows me to do that. And because the parchment is a little bit transparent, I can just put the parchment on top and trace the assembled design. So that's what takes the most time. But for the actual sitting down and painting and illuminating, I think my record is 1 day of straight work, which I don't recommend because it's very bad for your wrists and very bad for your eyes. Yeah, that was a red letter day. Magic in the Middle Ages. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. All right. Very good, Mela. Thank you so much for sharing this. Yes, that was a pretty major revelation for me. I don't know how much other people know about magic, but I was completely shocked to learn that magic hadn't always been something evil. Like, it's just wonderful to learn. And that there were different magic systems, and that perception of magic being evil came from all of the priests who learned Latin and used it to try to mess around with demons, and that got squished in with all of the women who were just practicing medicine. Very interesting. Yes, absolutely learn as much as you can. Any books I recommend on illuminated manuscripts? One of them is currently propping up my computer. Unfortunately, I will put it in the chat. Codices Illustres. This is the one that I recommend as an introduction because it's very good at presenting a kind of greatest hits, greatest manuscripts. If you want a really good, very visually overwhelming and very impressive introduction, I really recommend this book. It's gorgeous. It's very good at giving you the history of the manuscript and how it's put together. That was the one that was my big introduction. See, by Walter and Wolf. Introduction to Manuscript Studies. I have that one. I will grab it very quickly. Yes. All right. If you want to learn a bit more about construction, Introduction to Manuscript Studies, it's green and it has a man with a manuscript. Very good at talking about different kinds of manuscripts and what it's like to actually study them. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of the convention. Thank you so much for coming.